It was 12:35 in the morning on the 18th of January 1920 when Police Constable Leslie Betts walked through the narrow archway beside the Cross Keys pub on Lawrence Street, Chelsea. The 23-year-old constable was making his regular rounds, checking that premises were properly secured. This was standard procedure, something he had done hundreds of times before. But when he tried the door to the saloon bar at the side of the building, it swung open easily, unlocked. At midnight, PC Betts stepped inside and immediately stopped. Smoke, thick, acrid smoke filled the interior, making his eyes water. He blew his whistle hard, the shrill sound cutting through the night silence. Then he ran upstairs, checking every room on the second floor, then the third. Empty. All of them empty. When he came back down, coughing now from the smoke, he traced it to its source, the cellar. Smoke was pouring from the cellar doors, thick grey clouds billowing up through the cracks. Curtains had been drawn across the top of the cellar entrance. PC Betts pulled them aside, tried to descend the stone steps, but the smoke drove him back. His lungs burned. He couldn't breathe. He ran to the nearest fire alarm at Chelsea Old Church and pulled it. At 12:45 a.m, the fire brigade received the call. Station Officer C.J. Brown and his crew from Brompton Fire Station arrived at the Cross Keys within minutes. They descended into the smoke-filled cellar with their equipment, extinguished what turned out to be a small fire with ease. Then Brown's flashlight caught something in the back cellar. A heap on the floor. Sacking maybe. Rubbish. But when he moved closer, when the beam of his light illuminated the pile more clearly, Brown understood. It wasn't rubbish. It was a body. A woman's body, partially covered in sawdust, the upper portion covered completely, the legs only partially. At the foot lay a shovel. Nearby, siphons of soda water, bundles of bedding, odds and ends. The woman wore traces of a silk dress and white underclothing. Her head and face were covered in blood, battered beyond recognition. Brown called up to PC Betts. "There's someone down here, almost dead. Find a doctor, quickly." PC Betts ran. He returned with Dr. Grosvenor from Ogle Street, the police surgeon for the division. They arrived back at the pub shortly after 1 in the morning, but by then, the firemen had already carried the body upstairs to the saloon bar, attempting artificial respiration on the floor. PC Betts was surprised. He had thought the firemen said it was a man's body, but Station Officer Brown denied this. It was clearly a woman, an older woman. The landlady's small Pomeranian dog ran around the bar, quite lively, not barking at anyone. Dr. Grosvenor knelt beside the body and examined it. After a few moments, he looked up. "She's dead. Life is extinct." He believed she had died less than an hour before, sometime after midnight. The body was still warm, though the hands had gone cold. When shown a broken bottle and the pool of blood in the cellar where she had been found, Dr. Grosvenor concluded the bottle might well have been the murder weapon. The wounds were extensive. Slashes on both cheeks, several blows to the back of the head, one to the nose, slight burns on the calf of the left leg from the fire, but she had been dead before the sawdust was set alight. The victim was Frances Buckston, 53 years old, landlady of the Cross Keys pub. And 104 years later, her killer has never been identified. Frances Buckston had been born in 1867. She had married Frank Charles Buckston in Toronto, Canada, in 1888 when she was just 21 years old. They had at least one daughter together, Gwendolyn, who by 1920 was married and living as Mrs. Gwendolyn Whaley on Fiend Street, also in Chelsea. For the first 20 years of their marriage, Frances and Frank Buckston seemed to have a normal life together. But around 1908, when Frances was 41, everything changed. They separated. The reasons were stark. Frank Buckston disliked his wife's political views intensely. Frances was a suffragette at a time when women fighting for the vote were considered dangerous radicals. Worse still, in Frank's eyes, she was a socialist. These were not fashionable opinions for a woman of her class and era, but there was something even more damaging to their marriage. Frank had been unfaithful. He had engaged in an affair while in America and contracted a venereal disease, which he then passed on to his wife. Frances never forgave him. From 1908 onward, they lived entirely separate lives. Frank didn't see Frances again until August 1919, just 5 months before her death, when he was working as the landlord of the Sussex Hall in Sidley at Bexhill-on-Sea. After that brief encounter, he never saw her again. After the separation, Frances Buckston built a life of her own. She became a businesswoman, unusual for a woman of that era. She had been the licensee of at least 3 public houses. First, the Old George at Kensington, then the Star at Isleworth, and since 1914, the Cross Keys in Chelsea. The Cross Keys was a substantial property, a large brick-built beerhouse about 50 yards from the Chelsea embankment. It was 3 stories high with a broad frontage, described as a large, gloomy building of the early Georgian period. The pub dated back to 1708, making it one of the oldest in Chelsea. At the front was a large public bar, patronised mainly by working-class men. At the back was the saloon and private bar, where women and men mixed more freely, where the middle classes came to drink. Frances lived alone in the building, sleeping on the second floor. She employed 2 barmaids, Mrs. Mitchell and her daughter, Lily Mitchell, who also worked in a jewellery shop during the day. There was also a potman named Henry Whitehead, about 60 years old, who helped with the heavy work. For company, Frances had only her little Pomeranian dog. When Frances took over the Star at Isleworth, she had taken on a business partner, a younger man named Arthur Cutting. He came with her to the Cross Keys. This partnership was not an unmixed blessing. Henry John Penn, a ball finisher's assistant from Stern Street, Shepherd's Bush, and a friend of Frances since at least 1910, recalled a disturbing incident. I remember on one occasion, Mrs. Buckston came to my place at Shepherd's Bush and asked me to come over and stay the night at her house to protect her, as this Mr. Cutting had attacked her and held her down. That had been about 3 years earlier, around 1917, yet Cutting remained associated with the pub in some capacity. On Friday, the 16th of January 1920, 2 days before her murder, something happened that would later seem significant. Frances was working behind the bar when a man came in, a stranger. He was tall, between 5 foot 10 inches and 6 feet, with a long, clean-shaven face, light hair, and very piercing, close-set black eyes. He wore a bowler hat and appeared respectable, aged about 40, but his voice was unusually high-pitched for a man. The stranger began pestering Frances with intrusive questions about her love life, her personal situation. He asked her to have supper with him. Then he asked the question that made Frances's blood run cold. "Do you live here, at the pub, on your own?" Frances answered truthfully. "Yes." Then immediately realised how foolish she had been. Why had she told this strange man that she lived alone? The man tried to walk into her private parlour behind the bar. Frances pushed him out firmly, told him to leave, but the encounter rattled her badly. The next day, Friday, the 16th of January, Frances was still disturbed by the incident. She spoke to a local timekeeper, a man named either Briscoe Hervey or Detley Driscoll Harvey, depending on which account you read. She asked if he had noticed the man with the piercing black eyes. Another regular customer, Henry John Penn, was in the private bar that Thursday afternoon at about 1:00 p.m. He saw a tall man sitting at the back of the bar, about 5 feet 10 inches tall, wearing a brown coat and blue suit. Penn couldn't help but notice how the man behaved. He was all on the move, Penn would later testify, imitating how the man kept glancing about nervously. Mrs. Buckston was nicely dressed and in the habit of wearing diamond rings and brooches in the bar, and he kept looking at her over the counter. I could not help noticing that there was something funny about him. The man took no notice of the other customers. His eyes were only on Frances, on her jewellery, on her movements, on where she went. Penn stayed until closing time, then went into the sitting room behind the saloon bar with Francis. He asked her about the strange man. Francis was frightened. She felt that she and the pub were being watched. She wondered if it might be the police, monitoring the premises for evidence of improper conduct. This was always a concern for publicans, but in her heart she knew it wasn't the police. It was something else. Something dangerous. Saturday, the 17th of January 1920, began as a normal day. Frances worked her shift behind the bar. The barmaids, Mrs. Mitchell and her daughter Lily, were there helping. At about 10:30 that evening, the Mitchells left for home, leaving Frances alone in the pub. As far as they knew, no customers remained inside. Frances was completely alone. Police Constable George Hammond passed the Cross Keys twice late that Saturday night during his rounds. Each time, he found the doors locked, though there was a light burning inside somewhere. Everything seemed normal, secure. At 12:35 a.m, his replacement, PC Leslie Betts, checked the pub and found the side door to the saloon bar open, smoke pouring from inside, and in the cellar, Frances Buckston's battered body covered in sawdust, a small fire smouldering around her. The investigation began immediately. Detective Sarah Rodriguez, later accounts would call her, took charge of the case at age 34, though in actuality the detectives' names have been lost to time. What we know is that experienced officers arrived at the Cross Keys and began their examination. The scene told a story. Frances had been struck repeatedly with a heavy object, most likely the broken bottle found nearby. Her head had been battered until she was unrecognisable. Then someone had tried to cover the evidence. They had placed her body in the cellar, covered it with sawdust and sacking, and set fire to the sawdust, hoping the flames would destroy the body and any evidence. But the fire hadn't taken properly. The sawdust had smouldered, but not burned hot enough. The smoke had alerted PC Betts on his rounds. If the constable had been just 30 minutes later, if the fire had had more time, the evidence might have been completely destroyed. The killer had made mistakes. There were no signs of forced entry. The doors had been locked from inside. This meant Frances knew her killer. She had let him into the pub, or he had hidden inside before closing time, waiting for the barmaids to leave. The little Pomeranian dog hadn't barked, at least not loud enough for anyone to hear. This suggested the dog knew the killer, was familiar with him. The police questioned everyone connected to the Cross Keys. Frank Buckston, Frances's estranged husband, was contacted in Bexhill-on-Sea. He hadn't seen Frances since August. He had an alibi for Saturday night. He was cleared. Arthur Cutting, the business partner who had once attacked Frances, was questioned. His whereabouts on Saturday night were examined, but there wasn't enough evidence to connect him to the murder. The police had their suspicions, but suspicions weren't enough. Henry John Penn described the tall man with piercing black eyes who had been watching Frances so intently on Thursday. A decorator's manager came forward. He said that on Thursday, the 15th of January, he had been in the private bar of the Cross Keys at about 1:00 p.m. when he saw a man matching that description speaking to Frances. After the man left, the decorator's manager had teased Frances about having a fresh young man paying attention to her. Frances had replied that the man had been coming to the pub for 2 or 3 days, and that she had got him set, meaning she had him figured out. But she hadn't seemed pleased about it. She had seemed wary. The decorator's manager said he had observed the man watching Frances minutely, studying her every movement. That was why he had drawn Frances's attention to it. He and another man had even walked back with Frances at closing time one night because they were concerned. When they arrived, the young man had taken up a fighting attitude, becoming aggressive, but eventually he became quiet and they left. About 3 weeks before the murder, the decorator's manager had been passing the Cross Keys between 2:30 and 6:00 p.m. when he saw the young man standing at the corner of the alleyway leading to the premises with 2 other men he couldn't describe. The police searched for this man. They called in witnesses. A cleaner from the hospital and a dustman both said they were certain they had seen the young man near the Cross Keys at about 11:30 p.m. on the 28th of January, 10 days after the murder. Wait, that date couldn't be right. The records were confused. The police brought a young man into Chelsea police station for questioning. They cautioned him, told him they had information that he had been seen in the neighbourhood of the Cross Keys about 3 weeks earlier. He denied it completely. That's a lie. I haven't been in Chelsea for over 3 years. Without physical evidence, without a confession, the police couldn't hold him. In the weeks after Francis's death, another name emerged in connection with the case, a name that would become notorious. Percy Toplis. Francis Percy Toplis was 23 years old in January 1920. He was a soldier, a deserter, a criminal, and an imposter. He had served in the Royal Army Medical Corps during World War I, fighting at Gallipoli, serving in Salonika and Egypt. He had contracted malaria and been sent back to England. After the war, he became known for posing as an officer while on leave, wearing a monocle and officer's uniform, despite being only a private. In 1978, a controversial book would claim Toplis had been a leader of the Etaples mutiny in France in September 1917, though this has never been proven and official records show his regiment was en route to India at the time. Whether or not Toplis was actually at Etaples, by 1920 he was a man living on the edges of society, surviving by his wits, fraud and violence. And according to some accounts, Percy Toplis knew Francis Buckston. One man, Alexander McIntosh, admitted to having an affair with Francis. He was a regular at the Cross Keys, part of what was known as the Chelsea set, the bohemian radicals, anarchists and writers who frequented the area. According to Francis's estranged husband in Bexhill, Francis was a bit of a radical herself, an enthusiastic suffragette supporter and socialist, an intelligent and strong-minded woman with a string of successful bars and hotels to her credit. Some reports suggested that Toplis was one of Francis's many companions and was in receipt of gifts and remuneration from her. On the 17th of January 1920, the day of the murder, a sinister entry appeared in Toplis's diary. Just 3 words. Last of B. Last of Buckston. Had Toplis killed Francis? The police certainly wondered. In January 1920, Toplis was questioned as a suspect in Francis Buckston's murder, but there wasn't enough evidence to charge him. The police couldn't prove he had been at the Cross Keys on the 17th of January. They couldn't connect him definitively to the crime, and soon Percy Toplis gave them something else to worry about. On Saturday, the 24th of April 1920, around 9:45 p.m, a taxi driver named Sidney George Spicer was shot dead on Thruxton Down, near Andover. At 11:00 p.m, Toplis was seen alone in the car at Bulford Camp immediately before deserting again. He was now wanted for murder. A massive manhunt began. Toplis spent a fortnight masquerading among London society as a decorated army officer of landed descent. But press coverage of the Andover murder and the level of police activity forced the 23-year-old Toplis to flee to the northeast of Scotland. He hid in a remote gamekeeper's bothy near Tomintoul. On the 1st of June 1920, smoke from a fire he had lit was spotted by a hill farmer. The farmer returned with the gamekeeper and Constable George Greig. When confronted, Toplis shot and wounded both the gamekeeper and the constable, then fled south on a bicycle. He reached Aberdeen, then took a train to Carlisle, then began walking south along the Carlisle-Penrith Road. On Sunday, the 6th of June, he was questioned by PC Fulton at Low Heskett. Fulton was suspicious and went to get reinforcements from Penrith. He returned with Inspector William Ritchie and Sergeant Robert Bertram. They were joined unofficially by Norman de Courcy Parry, the Chief Constable's son. They spotted Toplis near Roman Way Farm near Plumpton. Inspector Ritchie challenged him. Toplis ran and began shooting at the officers. They fired 3 shots in return. 1 bullet struck Toplis, killing him almost instantly. The inquest on the 8th of June 1920 ruled that Toplis had been justifiably killed by a revolver bullet fired by a police officer in the execution of his duty. He was buried by the Board of Guardians in an unmarked grave in Beacon Edge Cemetery on the 9th of June. The vicar of Christ Church insisted he be given a Christian burial, saying, "This man was violently removed from this life before he could be judged on earth." When police examined Toplis's belongings, they found his diary. In it were abbreviated entries detailing his movements since the beginning of the year. Visits to Bristol, Cardiff, Swansea, London. An entry for robbery in Swansea. An entry for monocle bought 15 shillings in Bristol. Bath, Chepstow, Salisbury, Southampton, Winchester. And that entry on the 17th of January 1920. Last of B. Had Percy Toplis killed Frances Buckston? Was he the tall man with piercing eyes who had been watching her in the days before her death? The timing certainly fit, but without a confession, without physical evidence, the police could never prove it. Toplis took whatever he knew about Frances Buckston's murder to his grave. In the weeks and months after Frances's death, other theories emerged. 5 years later, in 1925, the case made headlines again when a man at Tottenham Police Court suddenly declared that his niece could solve the Chelsea murder mystery. The man had been charged with stabbing his nephew following an argument where he had made allegations about his nephew's wife. In court, one of the defendant's relatives commented about the nephew's wife, "Our niece doesn't want it known that she can give the information the police want to solve a Chelsea mystery of 4 years ago. The proprietress of a public house was found murdered and her jewellery stolen." The defendant was discharged and immediately turned to the reporters in the police court, asking them to print the family's allegations against the woman. Was this a baseless family vendetta, or was there really a witness who could say what had happened? The police investigated, but found nothing concrete. The accusation went nowhere. Then, in the summer of 1926, a Mr. Creed was murdered in a Bayswater provision shop. In coverage of that crime, newspapers noted that the circumstances of the murder of Mr. Creed are very similar to those in the case of the murder in 1920 of Mrs. Buckston at the Cross Keys public house. But no connection was ever established. The Cross Keys continued operating as a pub. After Frances's death, her friend Henry John Penn took over the remainder of her lease. Life went on. Customers drank at the bar where Frances had served them. The little Pomeranian dog presumably found a new home. But Frances Buckston's murder remained unsolved. One of London's unsolved crimes, as the newspapers called it. The case grew cold. Decades passed. The Cross Keys pub became part of Chelsea's history. Over the years, it would become a haunt for numerous celebrities. The artists J.M.W. Turner, Whistler, and Sargent drank there. Writers Agatha Christie and Dylan Thomas frequented the establishment. Musicians Bob Marley and members of the Rolling Stones were later spotted inside its walls. By the 21st century, the Cross Keys faced new threats. In 2012, property developer Andrew Bourne closed the pub's doors and applied for planning permission to turn it into a luxury mansion with a swimming pool in the basement. If successful, the property could have been worth more than £10 million. Local residents fought back. A campaign was launched to save the historic pub. In 2013, it was sold to Parsons Green Land for £3.9 million and later reopened as a pub. Today, a blue plaque on the wall commemorates the various notable personalities who frequented the Cross Keys over its 300-year history. But there's no plaque for Frances Buckston. No memorial to the 53-year-old landlady who was battered to death in her own cellar on a cold January night in 1920. The investigation into her murder revealed much about Frances's life. She was described by those who knew her as capable, attractive, and affluent. She had built a successful business in an era when few women did so. She had stood up for women's suffrage when it was dangerous to do so. She had embraced socialist politics when it meant losing her husband. She wore diamond rings and brooches as she worked behind the bar, symbols of her success and independence. But Frances had also made enemies. Arthur Cutting, her business partner, had once attacked her. The tall man with piercing black eyes had watched her for days, studying her movements, asking intrusive questions. Someone had waited until she was alone, until the barmaids had gone home, until the pub was locked and quiet. Someone had struck her repeatedly with a bottle, crushing her skull, battering her face beyond recognition. Someone had dragged her body down to the cellar, covered it with sawdust and sacking, and tried to burn away the evidence. Someone had locked the doors from inside and disappeared into the January night. Was it Percy Toplis, the monocled mutineer, the charming con man who would be dead himself within 5 months? Was it Arthur Cutting, the business partner with a history of violence toward Francis? Was it the mysterious tall man with the high-pitched voice and piercing black eyes? Or was it someone else entirely, someone whose name never even appeared in the investigation? The police files from 1920 are fragmentary. Much has been lost over the past 104 years. The witnesses are all long dead. The evidence has crumbled to dust. The truth died with Francis Buckston in that smoke-filled cellar. What we know for certain is this. On Saturday night, the 17th of January 1920, Francis Buckston was alive, working in her pub, serving her customers, living her independent life as a successful businesswoman in Chelsea. By 12:35 a.m. on the 18th of January, she was dead, murdered by someone she knew, someone she had likely served drinks to, someone who had stood at her bar and smiled at her. She was found covered in sawdust, her head crushed, partially burned, 53 years old, a suffragette, a socialist, a businesswoman, a mother, a wife, though separated, a friend to Henry John Penn and the others who knew her. Francis Buckston deserved justice. She deserved to have her killer caught, tried and punished. But justice never came. PC Leslie Betts discovered her body at 12:35 a.m. Station Officer C.J. Brown found her in the cellar. Dr. Grosvenor pronounced her dead. Detective officers investigated, questioned witnesses, followed leads. But in the end, no one was ever arrested. No one was ever charged. No one was ever convicted. The case file was marked unsolved and archived. And Francis Buckston became just another statistic, another cold case, another forgotten victim of violence in London between the wars. Today, if you visit the Cross Keys pub at 1 Lawrence Street, Chelsea, you can drink where Francis once worked. You can stand where she stood behind that bar, wearing her diamond rings, serving customers, making conversation. You can walk down to the cellar where her body was found. The building has been renovated multiple times over the past century, but the bones of it remain the same. That large, gloomy Georgian building, 3 stories high, about 50 yards from the Chelsea embankment. The oldest pub in Chelsea, established in 1708. And if you listen carefully, some say you can still sense something there. A presence, a memory. Maybe it's just the weight of history in an old building. Maybe it's the knowledge of what happened there on that January night. Or maybe, just maybe, it's Francis Buckston herself. Still there. Still waiting. Waiting for justice that never came. Waiting for someone to finally discover who killed her and why. Waiting for her story to be told. For 104 years, Francis Buckston has been waiting. The Cross Keys murder of 1920 remains one of London's most intriguing, unsolved cases. Not as famous as Jack the Ripper, not as well known as Dr. Crippen, but no less tragic, no less deserving of remembrance. Francis Buckston was murdered in her own pub by someone she knew for reasons we can only guess at. Robbery, perhaps. She wore valuable jewellery. Or revenge. She had made enemies, spurned advances, reported inappropriate behaviour, or perhaps something else entirely. Some dark motive that died with the killer. We will likely never know. The physical evidence is gone. The witnesses are dead. The killer, whoever he was, is long dead too. Percy Toplis died in a hail of police bullets in June 1920. Arthur Cutting faded from the records. The tall man with piercing black eyes was never identified, and Francis Buckston's murder became just another cold case in the archives, another unsolved mystery from London between the wars. but her story deserves to be remembered. Not just as a victim, but as a person. A woman who built a life on her own terms, who ran successful businesses, who stood up for what she believed in, who separated from her husband when he betrayed her, who wore diamond rings behind her bar and defied the conventions of her time. Frances Buckston lived, and on the 17th of January 1920, someone took that life away. The Cross Keys pub stands today, serving customers just as it did over a century ago. The cellar where Frances died is still there. The bar where she worked, the rooms where she slept, all still there. The building remembers, even if the people don't. And somewhere in the archives, in a box marked unsolved, the case file of Frances Buckston waits for someone to open it again, waits for new technology, new evidence, new eyes to look at the old details, waits for justice, even 104 years too late, because Frances Buckston deserves justice. She deserves to be remembered, not just as the landlady who was murdered at the Cross Keys, but as a person who lived, who mattered, who was taken too soon by violence. This is her story. The story of a woman who defied convention, who built a life of independence, who stood up for women's rights and socialist politics in an era when such things were dangerous. The story of a brutal murder in a Chelsea pub. The story of an investigation that failed to find the killer. The story of a century-old mystery that remains unsolved. The story of Frances Buckston, landlady of the Cross Keys, murdered the 17th of January 1920. May she finally rest in peace.